Brothers and sisters of Africa, a storm is brewing, not one of clouds or rain, but of truth, resistance, and revelation. Today, we stand at a moment where the curtain is finally being pulled back, and the lies that once shaped the world's view of Africa are crumbling. Ibrahim Traoré, the young, fiery leader of Burkina Faso, has done what no one dared to do before. He has called out the U.S. media for their web of manipulation, distortion, and propaganda against the dream of a sovereign Africa. It all began with a single headline that swept across major Western outlets: Burkina Faso's dictatorship tightens grip. CNN ran it, Reuters echoed it. The New York Times published long columns dripping with so-called concern for democracy. But what they didn't show, what they never show, is the truth. The truth that the people of Burkina Faso chose to stand with a leader who refused to bow to foreign masters. Traoré didn't respond with anger. No, he responded with precision. In his latest national address, he stood before thousands in Ouagadougou and said, in his powerful, calm tone, "They fear our independence more than our poverty. They want to keep Africa begging so they can keep pretending to save us." Those words sent shockwaves across the continent. Within hours, social media was ablaze from Dakar to Nairobi, from Accra to Johannesburg. Hashtags like Africa speaks for itself and We are not your story began to trend. The people understood. For decades, the global media machine had been writing Africa's story, but now Traoré had picked up the pen. Behind the scenes, intelligence sources revealed how coordinated this narrative war was. After Burkina Faso kicked out French troops and shut down certain Western NGOs, reports emerged that American media consultants were sent to West Africa to monitor political developments. But what they were truly doing was far more sinister, shaping international perception. Their mission: to portray Traoré as a reckless populist, a leader driven by ego rather than principle. Yet those on the ground saw something different. Roads being built, farmers getting support, the youth finding pride again. The U.S. media didn't show that because hope doesn't sell, control does. And Traoré knew it. He understood that wars are not only fought with guns but with stories. That's why he announced a new initiative, the African Sovereign Media Network, a coalition of local journalists, filmmakers, and independent broadcasters. Their goal: to tell Africa's truth uncensored and unfiltered. In his speech launching the initiative, Traoré declared, "We don't need Western permission to speak. Our truth is not a crime. Our voice is not a threat unless you live off our silence." The people roared. What happened next exposed just how nervous the West had become. Within days, major outlets began publishing new investigations, suddenly questioning Burkina Faso's human rights record, the state of its economy, and even its alliances with other African nations. But their strategy backfired, because now people across Africa were watching with new eyes, aware of the manipulation, dissecting every word and questioning every motive. Traoré's challenge wasn't just against Western media. It was against an entire system that treated Africa as a playground of narratives, where heroes are villains and villains are heroes, depending on who controls the lens. In private meetings, several African journalists have reportedly said that they were pressured to frame their stories in a pro-Western light to get published in global outlets. Some even admitted being offered funding to promote certain political views. But the tide is changing. As one Burkinabe reporter said in a viral clip, "We don't need to sell our truth to be seen anymore. Traoré made us believe our stories matter." Western think tanks are alarmed. They fear that if Burkina Faso's model succeeds, if independent African media becomes the new norm, their narrative monopoly will collapse. The U.S. State Department even issued a vague statement claiming that Burkina Faso is facing challenges with misinformation. But Africans know what that means. Misinformation is just what they call any truth that doesn't serve them. Still, Traoré remains calm. His government has begun working with local content creators and universities to establish programs teaching media literacy, to help the next generation identify manipulation, question headlines, and verify facts. It's a silent revolution, one that fights lies not with violence, but with knowledge. Every time the U.S. media attacks, Traoré grows stronger, because with each smear piece, more Africans awaken. More youth start asking, if he's so dangerous, why are they so afraid of him? And that's the question the West can't answer. Traoré has not only exposed the media machine, he's dismantling it from within. He's showing that Africa doesn't need validation from CNN or approval from Washington. In his own words, Africa is not a charity case. We are a continent of strength, of pride, of destiny, and from now on we speak for ourselves. The world is watching, and the lies are trembling. The battle lines were drawn not on the ground, but in headlines, broadcasts, and press rooms from Washington to Paris. After Traoré's fiery declaration that Africa would speak for itself, the U.S. media machine doubled down. Major outlets began publishing synchronized reports, each one echoing the same message. Traoré is isolating Burkina Faso from the world. But the people of Africa weren't buying it anymore. In cities like Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry, huge digital billboards lit up with messages of solidarity. Africa stands with Burkina Faso, a movement born entirely from the streets, not from state propaganda. The Western playbook was unraveling. Still, the propaganda war intensified. CNN ran a segment featuring so-called African analysts, voices trained in Western institutions, criticizing Burkina Faso's authoritarian tendencies. The BBC followed up with a special report showing only the poorest parts of Ouagadougou, narrating a story of chaos and fear. But that wasn't the truth. Because just a few miles away, something historic was happening. New factories, local cooperatives, and youth-led community projects were transforming lives. The people were not afraid. They were proud. And in a moment that shocked Washington's press corps, Traoré publicly called out these media giants during an address to African journalists. His tone was calm but sharp, each word deliberate. They say we are isolated, but who isolated us? They closed their doors, not us. We opened ours to Africa, to truth, to dignity. The hall erupted with applause. Then Traoré dropped what many are calling the media bombshell of the decade. He revealed a leaked document, reportedly shared by insiders within Western media networks, detailing a coordinated information strategy aimed at discrediting African governments refusing Western influence. The memo, titled African Narrative Control Framework, described plans to fund civil society voices and content partnerships that aligned with U.S. strategic goals. The crowd gasped. For years, Africans had suspected that foreign-funded NGOs and journalists were manipulating public opinion, but now there was proof. That night, the revelation went viral. Millions of Africans flooded Twitter and TikTok, dissecting every paragraph of the leaked memo. In just hours, hashtags like "Expose the Lies" and "Africa Will Not Be Silenced" dominated global trends. Western media scrambled. Some outlets claimed the document was fake. Others quietly deleted their initial articles about Burkina Faso, but the damage was done. The mask had slipped. For the first time, Traoré wasn't just a national leader. He was the voice of a continental awakening. African students in Europe started organizing panels about media decolonization. African-American commentators began drawing parallels between the suppression of African truth and the manipulation of black narratives in the U.S. The movement was spreading, not through governments, but through consciousness. Traoré capitalized on this momentum. He invited journalists from across Africa to a new media summit in Ouagadougou, a direct challenge to the dominance of Western-controlled press associations. The theme: Truth has no sponsor. Journalists came from everywhere: Nigeria, South Africa, Senegal, Ethiopia, even the diaspora communities in France and Canada. For the first time, Africa's media elite sat together without Western gatekeepers moderating the discussion. At that summit, Traoré spoke again, this time not as a politician but as a visionary. They called us voiceless, but we were never voiceless, they were just too loud. It's time we lower their volume and raise our truth. The audience stood, cameras flashed. The speech would later be translated into over 20 African languages. But in Washington, alarm bells rang. The U.S. Department of State issued a statement accusing Burkina Faso of undermining global media cooperation. Soon after, major American networks began airing stories linking Traoré to Russian propaganda. It was the oldest trick in the book. When you can't discredit the message, you smear the messenger. But this time, Africa was prepared. Young digital activists began fact-checking every Western claim in real time, exposing contradictions, double standards, and selective reporting. Independent African platforms gained millions of new followers overnight. And as the Western narrative crumbled, Traoré's vision grew. He wasn't fighting with bullets, he was fighting with truth. In a private meeting, one of his advisors reportedly told him, "You've turned the U.S. media's weapon against them." Traoré simply replied, "No, I've turned it back to the people where it belongs." The media war was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about every African nation that had ever been silenced, misrepresented, or manipulated. And for the first time, the empire of lies was losing control of its story. The winds of truth were blowing across the continent. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the African public was awakening, not to propaganda, but to clarity. Traoré's message had done what few thought possible. It broke through decades of Western narrative dominance. In every African newsroom, young journalists began questioning the way they reported stories. They stopped relying on Western wire services like Reuters and AFP. Instead, they built their own networks, African voices reporting African stories for the world. It was a quiet revolution. And Traoré, always strategic, encouraged it from behind the scenes. He didn't control the press, he inspired it. "A free Africa must have a free African press," he said in one of his meetings. "Freedom without truth is just another form of control." But freedom comes with a cost. Soon, Western embassies began raising concerns. Confidential cables leaked from Washington and Brussels described Burkina Faso's information independence movement as a potential threat to Western influence in sub-Saharan Africa. They accused Ouagadougou of encouraging anti-Western sentiment. But the irony was too obvious. Burkina Faso wasn't spreading hate, it was spreading awareness. Meanwhile, the ground reality in Burkina Faso was changing fast. The government launched a massive initiative called the Voice of Africa, a state-supported, pan-African media platform built to compete with CNN and BBC. Funded not by foreign donors, but by African nations themselves, it became a rallying point for authentic storytelling. Within weeks of its launch, the Voice of Africa was broadcasting in 15 languages: English, French, Arabic, Swahili, Hausa, Zulu, and more. Its slogan was simple but powerful: "From Africa for Africa to the world." This caught the world's attention. Suddenly, videos of African soldiers defending their nations, African scientists building new technology, and African women leading enterprises began flooding social media. The world was seeing Africa through African eyes, strong, proud, and self-reliant. Western media, long accustomed to shaping the narrative, was losing its grip. Ratings began to drop. Public trust in mainstream international outlets in Africa plummeted. And when African audiences were asked who they trusted more, Western journalists or their own, the answer was clear: their own. But the story was far from over. a new wave of disinformation hit. Anonymous accounts and think tanks began spreading rumors that Traoré was shutting down freedom of speech. They claimed journalists were being silenced. Yet every time these claims surfaced, African reporters themselves refuted them, live on air. Traoré never needed to defend himself. The people did it for him. Then came a twist no one saw coming. An internal memo leaked from a US-based intelligence contractor revealed that certain African correspondents working with Western outlets were being paid to push anti-Burkina Faso narratives. Screenshots, payment records, and messages flooded Twitter, confirming what many had long suspected. The response from African youth was explosive. Across universities and online forums, a single phrase began trending. "We see you now." The spell was broken. Traoré's government quickly turned the scandal into momentum. He announced the creation of an African Information Integrity Council, a regional watchdog to protect journalism from foreign manipulation. Its mission: transparency, accountability, and the defense of Africa's digital sovereignty. The first act of this council was to expose the network of fake NGOs and fact-checking organizations funded by Western interests to control online conversations. The findings were devastating. Millions of dollars had been funneled into Africa to distort its own truth. The revelations shook the diplomatic world. The European Union called the move uncooperative. The US demanded clarification, but Burkina Faso stood firm. In a press conference that went viral globally, Traoré looked directly into the camera and said, "You accuse us of misinformation because we no longer repeat your lies." That one line sent shockwaves across every newsroom from New York to London. The clip was replayed millions of times, dissected, debated, and admired. Western commentators tried to ridicule him, calling him overconfident or misguided. But the people of Africa saw something else: strength, authenticity, courage. Meanwhile, in the Sahel region, Burkina Faso's neighbors began adopting similar policies. Mali, Niger, and Guinea launched their own state-backed media centers focused on transparency and African-led reporting. The regional alliance was no longer military or political. It was informational. A revolution was happening not with guns, but with cameras and microphones. The Western narrative that once painted Africa as weak, chaotic, and dependent was collapsing under the weight of its own hypocrisy. And in that silence, the space left behind by broken propaganda, Africa's real voice finally began to rise. Traoré's strategy had gone beyond politics. He wasn't just leading a country, he was rewriting history. For the first time in generations, Africa wasn't being explained by outsiders, it was being defined by itself. But with every victory came a warning. Intelligence reports suggested that foreign powers were plotting ways to regain narrative control. Through social media algorithms, through funding independent influencers, and through global think tanks framing Africa's awakening as dangerous populism. Traoré knew what was coming. He called his ministers and said, "The more truth we reveal, the louder the lies will become. Be ready." That night, as the streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with life and celebration, Traoré stood at his balcony, looking over the city. His aide asked softly, "Do you think they will ever stop attacking us?" Traoré smiled and replied, "They will stop when they finally see that we are no longer listening." And at that moment, it became clear. The war for Africa's truth had just entered a new era. The ripple effect had turned into a tidal wave. What began as a national movement in Burkina Faso had now evolved into a continental awakening, and the world could no longer look away. In Paris, London, and Washington, analysts sat in dimly lit rooms, replaying Traoré's speeches with growing unease. Reports from intelligence agencies were now labeling him a cultural disruptor, a narrative threat, even a symbol of post-colonial defiance. But to Africans across the globe, from the crowded neighborhoods of Lagos to the skyscrapers of Johannesburg, from Harlem to Haiti, Ibrahim Traoré had become something far greater. A voice that finally said what they had all been waiting to hear. He didn't speak in the language of diplomacy. He spoke in the rhythm of truth. And the truth was spreading. African students studying abroad began forming Traoré dialogue circles, small community gatherings where they watched his speeches and discussed Africa's future. In New York, a viral rally erupted in front of the United Nations. Hundreds held up posters reading, "We don't hate the West, we just love Africa." It wasn't rebellion, it was reclamation. Meanwhile, African media houses began linking across borders. Burkina Faso's Voice of Africa partnered with Mali's Echo du Sahel and Guinea's Afrique Direct to form a shared news network that could reach every corner of the continent. No filters, no foreign editors. Just truth. And their reporting shook the world. They uncovered hidden Western lobbying in African parliaments, exposed secret mining deals, and revealed the extent of foreign interference in African elections. For the first time in history, the narrative was being written in reverse. The West wasn't teaching Africa anymore. Africa was revealing the West. But this movement wasn't without consequences. As the information war intensified, social media platforms began flagging or removing African nationalist content under vague policies. Entire pages vanished overnight. Burkina Faso's digital ministry accused the tech giants of censorship. Traoré responded not with anger, but with strategy. He announced the creation of AfriNet, Africa's first decentralized social media network, built and owned by Africans, powered by African servers, and shielded from foreign interference. It was an audacious idea. Some called it impossible. But within months, African engineers and coders from Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana joined the effort. Universities offered free participation, investors from the African diaspora contributed funds, and even Russia and China provided technical support. The first version of AfriNet went live within 6 months. Millions joined in the first week. On its front page, a simple message appeared. "We tell our story. No algorithm decides our voice." It was revolutionary. Burkina Faso, once seen as one of the poorest nations on earth, had become the digital heart of a continental rebirth. Traoré's speeches were now translated into 20 languages and broadcast on African radio stations, not as propaganda, but as education. Every quote, every line was discussed in classrooms, mosques, and marketplaces. One of his most powerful lines echoed across the continent. "They took our gold, our diamonds, our land, but what they fear now is that we've taken back our minds." And indeed they had. Even the African diaspora in Western countries began to shift. Afro-descendant communities who had long been disconnected from the continent started reconnecting spiritually, economically, emotionally. They began wearing African brands, supporting African tech, and investing in African-owned companies. A new kind of Pan-Africanism was being born, not in the halls of the African Union, but in the hearts of the people. And Traoré stood at its center. He wasn't calling for war, he was calling for dignity. He wasn't isolating Africa, he was uniting it. But Washington and Brussels were uneasy. A confidential U.S. report described Traoré as the most influential African leader of his generation. It warned that his popularity could permanently alter the balance of power between the West and Africa. In response, a major Western news outlet tried to run a documentary portraying Burkina Faso as repressive and unstable, but it backfired spectacularly. African journalists dismantled every claim within hours, line by line, live on air. The hashtag #HandsOffBurkina Faso trended across the continent for days. The tide had turned. In Ouagadougou, tens of thousands gathered outside the presidential palace, holding candles and waving both Burkina Faso's flag and a new one, the flag of the African Sovereignty Alliance. The crowd chanted in unison, "Africa for Africans, truth for the world." That night Traoré addressed the nation from the balcony of the palace. The air was electric, the streets alive with unity. He raised his hand, looked at the people and said, "Brothers and sisters, when they lied about us, we stayed silent. When they stole from us, we forgave. But now they fear us not because of our power, but because we no longer fear them." The crowd roared. He continued, his voice calm but powerful. "This is not the end of a fight. This is the beginning of freedom. Every African nation must rise, not with hatred but with purpose. We will build our own future brick by brick, truth by truth, dream by dream." At that moment fireworks erupted above the palace, illuminating the night sky in red, green, and gold. The chant grew louder, echoing through the city, through the continent, through history. And somewhere in a quiet office in Washington, a strategist whispered, "We've lost Africa." But Africa hadn't been lost. It had simply been found by itself. And as the world watched this new dawn unfold, one truth became undeniable. The era of controlled narratives was ending, and a new one had begun. An Africa that speaks for itself. If you want to keep watching stories that reveal what the world hides, then don't just scroll, subscribe, because this is just the beginning of Africa's awakening.